Thanks very much. Thanks, Mahesh, for your great talk this afternoon. We have cats too in Chicago. We have cougars, or at least one of them, but we didn't need Prince Philip to shoot it. Predictably, the Chicago Police Department shot it fairly expeditiously just a month or so ago. In 1912, Henry Chandler Coles, one of the first professors of botany in this university and one of the most influential of all American ecologists, wrote in the Transactions of the Illinois Academy of Science, "Many might think it strange that forest conservation should have a place of importance in the prairie state." And then he went on to argue for a more balanced approach to the stewardship of Illinois forests, to combat what he called the undue cupidity of the lumber interests. He urged the Illinois state legislature to establish state parks and protect forest resources, and as part of the Conservation Council of Chicago, he also helped defend the newly designated forest preserves of Cook County from a variety of assaults ranging from poaching of native orchids to the grazing of sheep. But Coles is important not just because he added his voice to the cry for a balanced approach to the management of Illinois forests, but because his thesis on the Indiana Dunes environment led him to the idea of ecological succession and the principle that underpins much of what we've heard over the past 2 days, whether it's forest resurgence in tropical Central and South America or farmer-managed natural regeneration in Niger. In his studies of the vegetation of the Indiana Dunes, Coles observed that over time, scrubby beach grass gave way to a range of herbs and woody plants. In turn, these were replaced by cottonwoods and pines that transitioned into oaks and hickories, which later yielded to forests of beech and maples. Coles demonstrated that the vegetation in any setting is dynamic and must be understood as the result of constant change. So however we weigh the influence of people on forests now and in the past, and however we interpret the multiple narratives about human interactions with forests, the successional processes through which forests change in time and space will continue. Those processes are, however, contingent. That is, their outcome is constrained by pre-existing conditions, and both that starting point and, as we saw in Robin Chasdon's talk, how those successional processes are manifested may be influenced to a greater or lesser extent, and often in subtle ways, by people. And here in Illinois, the interface between prairie and forest itself is a case in point. Coles understood that, at least in part, this is a matter of succession, but undoubtedly the successional replacement of prairie by woodland and forest has also been influenced to some undetermined extent by human intervention over the past few thousand years. We know that fire has been a key natural process in ecosystems for not just thousands but millions of years, but we also know that fire has been a potent tool through which people all over the world have sought to change and manage their environment. Disentangling the contingencies and the relative importance of these different factors and different processes is unlikely to be straightforward. Many of the papers that we've heard these past 2 days have focused on the biologically diverse forests of the South, and especially those in the tropics. To a large extent, we've been speaking about other people's forests. But as we've just heard, and as we saw in the paper by Roderick Newman, and as we'll see in David Foster's written paper, a further important dimension is added through consideration of temperate forests. Urban forests, which some define as any assemblage of trees in communities and cities, occupy a spectrum from neighborhoods with wooded yards that are heavily planted with street trees to semi-natural ecological communities. But across the spectrum, urban forests provide a variety of services. To be sure, they provide a habitat for diverse plants and animals, but their importance goes far beyond biodiversity. One of the co-authors on this paper, Lynn Westphal of the USDA Forest Service, based here in Chicago, has explored the health benefits of the urban forest. Similarly, studies by Frances Kuo and her colleagues at the University of Illinois at Chicago's Landscape and Human Health Laboratory have also documented those health connections. And other studies reveal that greener neighborhoods are not only perceived as safer by residents, they also have reduced incidence of street crime. These are values that this city's mayor believes in passionately, and you'll have seen some of the manifestations of that passion in the great attention that's been devoted to new landscaping in this city over the past 15 years. In short, there's a conviction, and one that's supported by at least some evidence, that urban forests are not just amenities, they're more broadly important for human and well-being. But interest in urban forests goes beyond street trees and parks to include those forests that are embedded in and around the city and that continue to display many of their characteristic natural features. These provide important ecological services, for example, flood control, but they're also important refuges for biodiversity. In the Chicago area, the patchwork of local ecosystems owes its existence to a particular combination of existing climatic conditions together with the late glacial history of the region over the last 14,000 years. Major glacial advances and retreats moved earth and rock and left behind a diverse mosaic of plains, moraines, kettle holes, beaches, and other features. After the last ice age, species from the east, south, and west coalesced here to form the natural communities of plants and animals that comprise the Chicago region's landscapes. And the result is a surprisingly diverse biota. Birds and amphibians and reptiles show impressively high levels of diversity here in northeastern Illinois. And the greater Chicago area, together with the extreme south of the state, are the two hotspots for biodiversity in what's otherwise a state landscape dominated by industrial agriculture. And these ecosystems are also globally important and relatively rich. I like to say that the small Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore has as many native species of plants as the whole of the British Isles. Within the rich diversity endowing the Chicago region are nearly a dozen types of woodland communities, including grassy savannas, distinctive oak hickory woodlands, and dense upland forests. Native Americans managed those lands for thousands of years, but through the 19th century, the magnitude and scope of human impact increased dramatically. In the early 1800s, it's thought that about 40% of the state was forested, but with the arrival of European settlers, demands on the region increased. Timber use for houses, fences, and fuel rose with growing populations. Over 300,000 people settled in Illinois in the 1830s alone. By 1923, only 22,000 of the original 13.8 million acres of forest remained. Ironically, Chicago's transformation into an urban area was in large part due to the rich natural resources of its hinterland, and especially its forest and deep, fertile prairie soils. William Cronon's book, Nature's Metropolis, traces the ties that bound urban and rural as the city evolved, highlighting connections between the booming economy of the growing city and the natural resources that supplied it. These changes inspired early forward-thinking individuals to act. John Rauch was one of them, who in 1869 formally proposed the formation of a Chicago Park District to secure lands for park purposes. Another significant move in protecting green space came with a revolutionary report published in 1904. In it, a group led by architects Jens Jensen and Dwight Perkins called not only for the designation of land for recreation, but for preserving some public lands in their natural states. So the conservation coalitions in Chicago, if you like, have deep roots. In 1914, that vision was realized and the Forest Preserve District of Cook County was created. And in parallel with these efforts, Daniel Burnham, the chief designer of the Columbian Exposition, was working with Edward Bennett on the visionary plan of Chicago, which was published in 1909. They imagined Chicago as a city beautiful with a system of parks and broad avenues echoing those of Europe. The plan was particularly rich in its integration of services such as transportation with parks and other recreational opportunities. Among its many legacies, perhaps the most important and most visible was Burnham's passionate insistence that Chicago's lakefront remain forever open and free. And also, thanks to Burnham's foresight, a green belt was maintained not only along much of the lakefront, but along some of the major rivers. The foresight of Burnham and others served us well, but Chicago is now a vast conurbation that's home to more than 8 million people. In this region, as much as anywhere else in the nation, we have the jarring juxtaposition of the remnants of heavy industry, accelerating urban sprawl with astounding biological diversity, albeit biological diversity distributed through a patchwork of fragmentary prairie, woodland, dune, and wetland systems. And that juxtaposition raises many questions regarding the long-term management of these communities, as well as the organisms that comprise them. Throughout the 20th century, the forests of the Chicago region came under increasing assault. In late 1994, The Illinois Natural History Survey published a report called The Changing Illinois Environment, Critical Trends. It concluded Illinois is moving from complex natural systems towards simple ones, from stable systems towards unstable ones, from native species towards non-native ones, from integrated systems towards fragmented ones, and from self-sustaining systems towards managed ones. In terms of overall land use, the prevailing historical pattern in Illinois is from unmanaged, relatively unmanaged complex systems to managed simpler systems. As the report put it, with increasing simplicity of habitats, animals and plants that are ecological specialists have disappeared, and over most of the state, what we have instead is the development of what you might call a generic Illinois biota, dominated by carp, starlings, deer, and generalist weed. For those natural habitats that do remain in northeastern Illinois, there are a variety of threats, but the most obvious and most visible is further habitat fragmentation as urbanization increasingly competes for available land. In northeastern Illinois, these problems are particularly acute, and I won't bore you with the statistics, but simply to say that between 1970 and 1990, the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission estimated that the combined population of Cook, DuPage, Lake, Kane, McHenry, and Will counties, that's the greater Chicago area, grew by 4%, that's not so much, while the area of urbanized land expanded by 51%. So it was against that background that the remarkable effort documented in Miracle Under the Oaks by William Stevens unfolded. This effort, the Prairie Project, involved the labors of a group of volunteers to restore prairie, savanna, and woodlands. The success of that project created stark contrast with many other natural areas that were languishing without management. And in response and in recognition of the unique natural communities in the Chicago region, leaders from 34 private and public organizations came together to work strategically to conserve and manage the ecological communities and watersheds of the Chicago region, and to try and create a metropolitan area in which nature thrives in harmony with people. So in 1996, we launched the Chicago Wilderness Initiative, an unconventional regional conservation effort, conservation coalition, in the greater Chicago metropolitan area. The Chicago Wilderness Consortium has grown to more than 220 public and private member organizations, including federal, state, county, and local agencies, municipalities, conservation organizations, universities, park districts, homeowners, faith-based organizations, and schools. The governance is complicated. I won't go into it here, but it's obvious that the consortium only works to the extent that there's engagement both among its members and between its members and the broader communities in the Chicago area. So what's Chicago Wilderness done? Soon after Chicago Wilderness inception, the group set out to document the biological resources in the region. In this publication, an atlas of biodiversity. The idea was to draw attention to the natural heritage and natural resources in the Chicago region. Following the publication of the Atlas of Biodiversity, the consortium began shaping a plan to save the region's plants and animals through restoring and maintaining thriving habitats. Following 3 years of work with a broad array of private and public stakeholders, the Chicago Wilderness Biodiversity Recovery Plan was published in 1999. It tries to prioritize the natural communities of the region in terms of their regional and global significance and the degree to which they're losing native species. It serves, if you like, as the coalition's or consortium's roadmap for recovery, providing a guide for where and how to restore and protect those ecosystems. And importantly, its goals address not just the region's nature, but the connections between nature and people, and especially the importance of engaging with and involving citizens, organizations, and agencies in the region. A significant part of that effort is engaging and training volunteers who supply the passion and the labor to restore landscapes, large and small. Many thousands of trained volunteers throughout the region participate in the work of the consortium. And they help restore habitat through activities such as invasive species removal, planting native shrubs and flowers, and assisting with controlled burns. And some of them are citizen scientists who help to monitor wildlife and plant populations. A particular focus has been, over the past decade, has been engaging with key constituents. And perhaps some of the best efforts have been devoted to the archetypical Rust Belt of South Chicago and Calumet, an area degraded by industry, yet still rich in biological and social diversity, and really the area that connects the core city of Chicago to the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. An engagement with those local residents, figuring out their social networks, how their organizations work, their existing forms of activism, has been important not only for engaging them, but also for informing the work of the coalition. And their views about what the objectives of conservation in this area be cover a wide spectrum, from attempting to restore natural habitats to a so-called pristine condition, to simply restoring the habitats so that resources can be extracted, and judging success by how much resource can be extracted. But what most people agree on is, in some defined sense, is keeping those areas healthy. And through that dialogue, policymakers, environmentalists, and other interested parties have the opportunity to engage with local organizers in stewardship and conservation activities. A new initiative of Chicago Wilderness is the New Allies Project. And over the past year, the group has conducted over 100 conversations with organizations through the region and has identified common concerns that connect environmental and socio-cultural issues such as youth programming, climate change, nature and art, and so on. And another program, the Leave No Child Inside initiative, builds on the Mighty Acorns program of the Nature Conservancy to engage school children in conservation and restoration activities. In April of 2006, 10 years after the consortium beginning, the Chicago Wilderness released its report on the state of Chicago wilderness. And it wasn't particularly positive. 68% of the land in the region is in poor condition. Only 4% of oak wood plots were in excellent condition, 42% of them were in poor shape. The estimate came back, the rather daunting estimate came back, that there was something on the order of 26 million individual invasive buckthorns in the Chicago wilderness area. And controlling those invasive species is one of the most important jobs in restoring these ecosystems. So what do we do need to do to make the report card better next time around? Well, basically it's about gardening, managing the ecological processes of succession to get the desired outcomes that communities want. And in particular, in terms of large and small-scale restoration and management, historically it's been the frequency and intensity of fires that's helped determine the type of woodland community at a given site. And fire has been one of the most controversial issues in restoration in the Chicago region. For example, in 1996, a controversy erupted surrounding the use of fire in ecological restoration, which ultimately led to a 10-year ban against the use of fire in the restoration of prairie and woodland communities. That process is now starting to come back and is the key mechanism for managing these lands and for controlling invasive species. But I think the gardening metaphor is useful in another way, because in a general sense, the Chicago Wilderness Coalition knows what it's doing when it's restoring, in a general sense. But in terms of the specifics, it really doesn't. We know very little, for example, about what the relative effects are of burning at different times of the year. We know relatively little about the details of how succession occurs in some of these environments. So there's still lots of work to be done on the restoration front. But there are, we've talked a little bit about, just a moment ago, sorry for the missing picture, we talked a little bit a moment ago about how land is acquired, and land acquisition is going on apace in the Chicago area. Chicago area residents have approved, one way or another, about $1 billion worth of funds for open space acquisition over the last 10 years. But there have been some really big hits. Midewin, what's now Midewin National Tallgrass Prairie, came perhaps as with the end of the Cold War, with the conversion of the US Army's Joliet Army ammunition plant. And gardening there is moving ahead very fast, removing the drainage tiles, attacking the non-native trees and shrubs, burning to encourage the growth of native prairie, and so on. Another one was the, excuse me, got the wrong button there. Another one was the acquisition of the Fort Sheridan Army base to preserve some of the last remaining ravines that drain down into Lake Michigan. So there's a lot going on. There's certainly lots of programs that are being worked through, but a particularly important moment comes next year with the centenary of the Burnham Plan. Commissioned by the Commercial Club, that Burnham Plan is in large part the reason we have the forest preserves ringing the city today. And in the late 1990s, the Commercial Club again helped to stimulate a plan for the region, which they called the Chicago Metropolis 2020 plan. And along with that plan has been a consolidation of the planning approaches here in northeastern Illinois, and the creation of the Chicago Metropolitan Area for Planning, CMAP, which takes over the old Chicago Area Transportation Study and the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission. And as part of that has been the development through Chicago Wilderness of a so-called green infrastructure vision, an interconnected network of land and water that supports biodiversity and provides habitat for the plants and animals at the regional scale. The green infrastructure vision covers roughly 360,000 acres of protected land. And ultimately, I think, in the medium term, the success or otherwise of the Chicago Wilderness Initiative will hinge very much on the extent to which it's been able to deliver on that green infrastructure vision. Several of the key regional planning agencies have already adopted that vision, including CMAP. So the prospects, at least, are encouraging. So in just over a decade, Chicago Wilderness has really come a long way in developing a reasonably inclusive model of regional conservation. It's a model that's attracted attention from other urban areas who'd like to implement a similar approach, Houston, Cleveland, San Francisco, and so on, but also from places in the South. There's a strong partnership with the Curitiba metropolitan region, for example. But yet, even as Chicago Wilderness attracts interest from elsewhere, the work at home has really only just begun. In terms of science, there's a clear need to better understand the successional processes at work in Chicago area forests and other natural communities. And in terms of conservation practice, there's a clear need for better scientific understanding of the details of restoration in order to improve the quality of management of new and existing areas. The green infrastructure vision is a powerful organizing vision for the future, and ultimately the success or otherwise of Chicago Wilderness, as I've said, will depend on that. But finally, there's still much more to be done to continue the process of engagement with stakeholders to better understand their aspirations and need, and also to build broader support for the interventionist gardening practices needed to repair and restore the forest and other plant communities of the Chicago area. To return to Henry Chandler Coles, I mean, I said that this coalition has deep roots. I think the vision for Chicago Wilderness is a multifaceted and pluralistic one. Coles himself spoke of a vision of forest tracts numerous enough to be within easy reach of all of our people and managed to serve many interests economic, scenic, and educational. And I think still, at some level, that's still the overall goal of the Chicago Wilderness Initiative. Thank you very much.
Do we have some questions?
It's a very interesting presentation. Could you say a little bit more about ecological restoration efforts and natural regeneration in the urban core? Because most of your examples seem to me to be somewhat on the periphery of the city.
On the periphery, in the urban core, I mean, there's not been so many specific attempts. I can think of one attempt in Grant Park to establish a prairie, which didn't go down too well. But not too far out. I mean, we're not really talking about the suburban fringe here. We're talking about tracts of lands that are deeply embedded in the metropolitan area. And that is largely a result of that historical vision of Burnham and others, who basically set up this ring of forest preserves, which were for them an outer ring, but are now, of course, just completely subsumed by the suburban development that's gone on outside them. So those restoration activities are going on in that ring, and it's an important ring because it's a ring that people have easy access to. And that's also important for things like flood control and so on.
So there's nothing systematic being done on natural regeneration on big lots?
Not really.
Rod Newman, Florida International University. That was a fascinating talk, and I'm looking forward to buying the publications. I'm living in San Francisco Bay Area this year, and recently a coyote moved into Golden Gate Park, and people sort of freaked out. And it turns out that various animal control agencies have killed a dozen or two coyotes a year. And in the report in the paper, it was dwarfed by the number of coyotes killed in the Chicago area by animal control, like 300 a year or something like that. So it sounds like you have some kind of urban wilderness interface issue going on here.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's true. And I think another very interesting thing is that people who live in the cities have a rather different view of how you might approach a problem like that. So a big issue in Chicago, I mean, the second biggest issue after fire is deer. And it's absolutely clear that we have an overpopulation of deer. The deer need to be controlled. You can see them all over the city. But gaining public support to control those deer is a very, very contentious issue. So you've got the sort of imposition of a kind of an urban view, or idealized view of nature, whereas that hunting would go on very naturally, obviously, out in those urban in the rural areas. So I mean, we do have that issue, but deer is the biggest problem, hugely contentious, and a real fight between people who want to protect Bambi and people who, like me, are interested in wildflowers.
Why would they be worried about coyotes? Because they feed on deer, or because they just think they're a burden?
I think it's a vermin sort of issue, I think.
All right. Raymond?
There is a different vision, as it were, in Chicago as elsewhere, I think, to what you're talking about, and that is the suburban lawn. This kind of iconic aspect of modern life here as elsewhere. Is there any effort in this campaign to try and persuade, cajole, challenge suburbanites who have this dogmatic faith in the lawn? Yeah,
absolutely. There clearly is an effort to plant native species, but I would say that that's a growing trend anyway. But also, it's pretty clear that lawns are going to be around for quite a while. And but I think those are already coming under scrutiny from a variety of different angles, from the water use angle, but also from the the engines that power them as being a major and leaf blowers and other things as being a major contributor to urban smog. So, and the EPA does regulate now two-stroke engines. So, I mean, that issue, I think, is going to get addressed, and it is part of this, but it's also being come at from a variety of different directions.
Justin?
Peter, I just wanted to ask, what's the vision for lawn, maybe, or the whole restoration vision for the Fort Sheridan acquisition?
The Fort Sheridan acquisition is by open lands, and obviously the vision is to try to stabilize those ravines because they're very susceptible to erosion, but also to create public access to what's a really unique part of the Lake Michigan shoreline. Most of our shoreline is controlled in one way or another, and these are some of the last vestiges, again, protected by the military over a long period of time, where you can still see those natural ravines. So some limited restoration, increased public access, construction of paths and so on to allow them to gain access to those areas, but without clambering up and down in the ravines themselves, which will ultimately lead to their destruction and erosion.
Okay. Susanna, do you want to have...
One of the things that's driving a certain amount of expanding wilderness in urban areas, east and southwest, is, of course, climate change, which means that you're under much more water control.
Yeah.
And also, of course, the use of trees increasingly, like farm layers, a million tree initiative and so on, because this so much lowers the heat island effect.
Sure.
And finally, of course, because we need now to do a lot more water recharge to keep those bastions of asphalt working months. Much more gravel, much more vegetated, and much more open in order to increase the infiltration. So there's a lot of movement actually toward sort of naturalizing the city. And also, of course, those of us who don't have cats feel thrilled that there are coyotes eating them, because this way we
The
have
birds.
more songbirds.
Yeah. Those are just the kinds of issues that the USDA, that's why the USDA is interested in those urban forestry issues, and I think it's important not to exclude from the urban forestry issue those lots, those street trees that contribute to, in some places where you fly over Chicago, it's a pretty green city, and they're as important to the people that live in those communities as these set-asides and forest preserve areas.
This is a quick adaptation because it's rather humorous. Of course, there are these places where animals can go under the freeway, and of course those clever coyotes, those animals go through, and the coyotes are waiting upon them.
Thank
So
you.
Just to know that nature's web.